Still in chapter 11 of Isaiah. We'd gotten down to verse 13, had not gotten into it yet, but this section starts back in verse 11, and I put it the regathering of the Jews. And let's just start reading from verse 11 and go through verse 13. And I did check this week, and I do have the King James Version pulled up as opposed to a different one like I did last week. And that's very easy to do. And the way it happened, very simply, I have 4 different reading plans in reading through different sections of the Bible. One of them is this month reading through Proverbs. I do that every month. And this month reading it in the ESV. And so I just had the ESV pulled up. So, it is going to be King James this time, though. It shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria and from Egypt and from Paphos and from Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea. And he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcast of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah. The envy also of Ephraim shall depart, and the adversaries of Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not envy Judah, and Judah shall not vex Ephraim. So here's a second, as he puts it, second time to recover the remnant of his people. The first regathering, as we mentioned, would have been under Cyrus and his decree in 536, led initially by Zerubbabel. The second one that he's talking about, and thus this, is the Christian dispensation. And so now then, we get down to verse 13. I'll mention in verse 11 also, he mentions the universal nature of this recovering the remnant and talking about all of these nations. And he sets up a banner, an ensign for the nations, something to bring their attention to and to rally behind. So the envy also of Ephraim shall depart in verse 13, and the adversaries of Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not envy Judah, and Judah shall not vex Ephraim. There was an envy and a vexation between the two nations of Israel and Judah. Go back, they were, of course, a united kingdom under Saul, David, and then Solomon. But at Solomon's death, there's a division that takes place in the kingdom between the northern kingdom and 10 tribes there called Israel, or sometimes Ephraim, as we see here. And then the 2 southern tribes, which compose the southern kingdom, also referred to as Judah, as we see here in this verse. And so here's Ephraim, or the northern kingdom, and the southern kingdom, those 2 kingdoms. But in that division, there was an enmity. Hopefully you recall or remember the situation that arose that brought about the division. Actually, it was a division that was brought about by God as a result of Solomon's sin. But the people had gone to Solomon's son, who was Rehoboam, and requested, reduce the taxes that are upon us. Rehoboam at first makes a wise decision and goes and asks the older men. And they give him the advice, do what the people say and they will follow you. But that one advice didn't suit him too well, so he took an unwise decision and went to the younger people. And they said, you tell the people that they hadn't seen nothing yet, that the taxes are going to be a whole lot higher, that while Solomon chastised you with whips, I'm going to use scorpions, and it's just going to be so much worse. And when he told them that, they said, well, what lot do we have in the tribe of, or in the seed of David? You see to your own business and we'll leave. And so there's the division of the kingdom. When they divided, the northern kingdom going, basically having Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, as their leader, and he is described through the rest of the scripture as who made Israel to sin. Rehoboam at first wanted to go to war with the northern kingdom and Jeroboam and to put this insurrection down. And basically God said, don't do it. And so he was not allowed to go to war. But that's what he wanted to do. But as a result, there was that enmity between the two nations. Well, now then, that enmity and that, as it's used here, envy, that existed between these two nations, it's going to be abolished. It shall depart. The two nations would dwell together as one nation again. From a physical standpoint, that wasn't going to take place. It could only take place in a spiritual aspect. Jesus, being the Prince of Peace, would thus bring peace between both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, or basically between all people. And the fightings, the jealousies that existed between Judah and Israel, it's going to end. Eddie Whitten wrote that here God, through Isaiah, is announcing to the nation of Judah that the time would come when all the people of the world would hearken unto the ensign of the Messiah, would be brought together in a spiritual kingdom which would know no geographical boundaries. The enmity that once divided the physical kingdoms of Israel and Judah would no longer exist. In fact, no physical boundaries would be a factor in the makeup of God's spiritual kingdom. And that is the end of the quote. And that's really what Isaiah is dealing with here. That spiritual nature of the kingdom. Turn over, if you will, to Ephesians, the 2nd chapter. Really wasn't planning on getting into this aspect, but I think it would be good to deal with it. If you go back to verse 1, really, Paul is going to deal with the condition that they were once in, that is, in sin because of their practices, but by God's grace they have been saved. That's the first 8 verses. Verse 11, though, notice how he starts out. Wherefore remember that ye, being in time past Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by that which is called circumcision in the flesh, made by hands. So here he's dealing with Jew and Gentile, while Isaiah is talking specifically about Ephraim and Judah, or Israel and Judah. There's the peace that's going to come in that situation. In the New Testament, it's expanded to all people. And that's what we start here. Verse 12, at that time ye were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ Jesus, ye who were sometimes far off are made nigh by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace, who hath made both one, and hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make in himself of twain one new man, so making peace, that he might reconcile both unto God in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity thereby, and came and preached peace to you that were far off, and to them that were nigh. And for through him we both have access by one Spirit unto the Father. Now therefore ye are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God. Now, you look at that, while he's dealing with Jew and Gentile, he shows that both now have peace. Christ, being that Prince of Peace, came, and he, who is our peace, made both one. That's in verse 14 again. Now then, between the Jew and Gentile, that which divided them was the law of Moses, and so he explains that that law of Moses has been abolished, the latter part of verse 14 and verse 15, so that all people could be reconciled to Christ, or to God, through Christ and the blood that he shed, the blood of the cross. So there's the peace that exists between all people. Well, now then, coming back to Isaiah, he's dealing with that time frame. And he's using, here's Judah and Israel, and the fighting, the warring that went on between those two nations, it ceases under Christ. They become and live together in unity. And as Brother Whitten put there, there's no physical boundaries. Would be a factor in the makeup of God's spiritual kingdom. That takes us back to what we saw in going through all of those nations. No boundaries in regards to God's spiritual kingdom, the church. Okay, Dale?
He's like redescribing what he already said with other words, under different descriptions in 6 to 9 about the animals.
He is. He uses different figures to express the same ideas. And so in that case, it was, here's the animals dwelling together in peace. Now then he's using the two nations dwelling together in peace, and that all the nations of the earth would be a part of this spiritual kingdom. Then in verse 14, but they shall fly upon the shoulders of the Philistines. Toward the west they shall spoil them of the east together. They shall lay their head upon Edom and Moab, and the children of Ammon shall obey them. Again, the fulfillment of this is seen, actually verses 14 through 16, is seen in the spread of the gospel after the establishment of the church in Acts, the 2nd chapter. Here it is being typified by using Israel's foes. The Philistines, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, all of those were constant enemies of Israel. And so when he shows that they're going to basically be in unity, that he's showing that these nations who have been at odds and have been fighting through the centuries, there's peace now. And here in particular, that the spread of the gospel, which brings that peace, is going to be very quick. Thus they shall fly upon the shoulders of the Philistines toward the west. If we had a map, I'm not going to try and go through that we did last week with the maps, unless y'all want me to. But if you're looking at, just think of, here's the Mediterranean Sea. The land of Canaan is here. The Philistines would be in the southwestern part of the land of Israel, or the land of Palestine. So those would be to the southwest. And he's showing here, he's using this figure of Israel would make a very sudden, victorious descent upon the Philistines. Then they shall spoil them of the east together. The ones on the east of the Israelites were basically the Arab nations. And again, there was an enmity between the Arab nations and between the Israelites. It seems like the Israelites were hated by all of the people everywhere throughout their history. But you could almost say that in relationship to every nation at that time. They were hated by all the other nations. But the idea of fly is the idea of something that is being done very rapidly. It's quick. It is a real fast assault upon them, if you will. Okay, Dale?
Can I ask you a question?
You can ask. That doesn't mean I'll answer.
Would I be stretching it to say that in Isaiah 40, when he shall have wings like eagles and be strengthened with the Lord there in the end of the last 3 verses of 40? Could that be associated with flying on the shoulders of the Philistines?
I don't think that the ideas are being expressed there are the same. Here it's dealing with swiftness. There it's dealing with the strength and the might that those wings would bring. Edom, again, thinking of your map, would be down here toward the south of Judah. So if you've got maps in your Bible, you can see these real easy. And they would lay their hands upon Edom, Moab, both of those. The idea of laying their hand upon them is presenting the idea they're going to take possession of them. So they're going to take possession of these lands. Edom, which is south of Judah, and then Moab is to the east of Jordan. So you've got the Mediterranean Sea, you've got the land of Palestine here, you've got the Jordan River, and then over here you then have the Moabites. And just above them you have the Ammonites. So all three of these nations lay right next to the Israelites. And of course, again, they would be all antagonistic toward them. But again, this is showing the spread of the gospel. That Israel basically, they go down to Philistines. They then go to the east, the Arab nations. They go to Edom, Moab, the Ammonites. So they're spreading, is the idea that is being presented to us, and they're spreading quickly. So here's the spread of the gospel. Verse 15, then he goes on, that the Lord shall utterly destroy the tongue of the Egyptian sea, and with his mighty wind shall he shake his hand over the river, and shall smite it in the 7 streams, and make men go over dry shod. God is going to destroy then the tongue or the gulf of the Egyptian sea, along with the river Euphrates. Again, this is a description of the spread of the gospel, and that God is removing these barriers so that he is opening up the way for the spread of the truth during the New Testament age. That those barriers that existed because of these nations, they don't exist anymore. And so it can go both east and west. None would be excluded in that. When we get down to this phrase, he shall smite the 7 streams. Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown in their commentary state, and they basically are quoting 2 different individuals here, shall smite it or divide it by smiting into 7 or many streams, so as to be easily crossed. And they mention that's the view of Loth. Then so Cyrus divided the river Ganges, which retarded his march against Babylon, into 360 streams, so that even a woman could cross it. And that was a quote from Herodotus in his writings. But basically, he just using this, he is going to smite it in the 7 streams, that he's going to destroy this to such an extent that when men cross it, they're not even going to get their shoes wet. That river, that stream, whatever, however you want to express it, is so destroyed that they can cross it without getting their shoes wet. Now then, why? The spread of the gospel.
You know what that reminds me of?
What?
This is the victory that overcomes the world, even our faith. We can cross obstacles by faith.
Well, that's a crossing of obstacles, and that you say is true, but that's not what this is dealing with. This is dealing with the ability of it to spread, not overcome obstacles so much. That God has removed those obstacles that would prevent the spread of the gospel. Wayne Jackson made an interesting point in relationship to this, these couple of verses. And he writes that this cannot literally refer to some future restoration of Israel to Palestine, as millennialists argue, is evidenced by the fact that these national enemies of Israel have long ago perished from the earth. Where are for example, the Ammonites today? Where are the Moabites today? They don't exist. If this demands a literal fulfillment, how can it be fulfilled if those nations that he's talking about do not even exist? The premillennialists argue that this is going to be some millennial kingdom in the future. It is a literal fulfillment. But if it's a literal fulfillment, and again, that's basically what they do to all of the prophecies of the Bible or of the Old Testament, they try to, instead of realizing the figurative language that is being used, they try to literalize it, so that it has to be a literal fulfillment. If this is going to be literally fulfilled, how are you going to get these nations that don't exist? And that's the point Brother Jackson is making in this. And it's a very valid question. If they are going to literalize this, how do you get these nations? Where do they come from, since they don't exist now? There are no Ammonites. There are no Moabites. So where are they going to come from? I could jokingly say, well, I guess God's just going to pop them up so that they come back into existence. That's as good an answer as any for them. But in reality, it again shows the figurative nature of these prophecies. And to try to take them and make them literal is doing an injustice to the prophecy. Now, if you see that in relationship to this and those nations no longer existing, and thus it has to be figurative, when we go back a few verses to the animals dwelling together in peace, we start saying those must be figurative as well. Jason in his class on premillennialism and talking about Revelation 20, it's amazing what generally, when you're dealing with premillennialism and that system of theology, I put it that way because it's not a doctrine. It is a system of theology that you have to change and interpret the entire Bible according to that system. So it's not just one doctrine, but when they get to Revelation 20, and there's different views again, the bottomless pit, the chains, all of these things, they'll say, oh yes, that's figurative language. But that 1,000 years is literal. So, by what right do they pick one thing out and say it's literal when everything else around it's figurative? What we see here is figurative language being used all throughout. And thus this isn't referring to some future period of time of that 1,000 years of the premillennialist. It's dealing with the spread of the gospel during the Christian age. Okay, Dale?
Are there any exceptions figurative followed by literal, figurative followed by literal within one chapter anywhere in the Bible? Any exceptions?
There are some exceptions, yes. The destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew 24. You have literal things. For example, when you see he uses figurative language for the departure of the Roman armies, you leave. Was the leaving literal? Get out of town real quick. Don't go back to get anything. Pray that it not be on the Sabbath. Why? Because the gates would be locked and closed. I guess I should say closed and locked, shouldn't I? On that one. And that the women not be with child. Why? Because it makes it difficult to escape. Those things are literal. Yet how much of it is figurative? Most of it is figurative. So you do have at times mixing of the literal and the figurative. It's context and, dare I say, a little bit of common sense or good old horse sense. A lot of times if we use some horse sense, the Bible would be a whole lot clearer. Verse 16 then, that there shall be a highway for the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, like as it was to Israel in the day he came up out of the land of Egypt. A highway. Someone turn over to Isaiah 35 and read verse 8 for us. Isaiah 35 and verse 8. Okay. A highway is going to be there. This is oftentimes referred to as the King's Highway, is what he's dealing with. If a king was planning to make a trip from one place to another place, they would send their slaves generally ahead of them, and they would clear out a pathway so that the king could go through that area without any obstacles or obstructions. It was a way that was generally, and when you get to Isaiah 35:8, a very clear way. It's easily seen. In fact, you could generally see the King's Highway a long ways off, because it was a clearly defined way in which the king was going to travel. A lot of times they would build it up from the rest of the land. And so here's the idea at the end of that verse: the wayfaring man, though fool, shall not err therein. It's so easily seen that anyone can see it and they're not going to miss it. They can walk on it. They can, and here it is, the way of holiness, the way in which they're going to live. But that highway is thus a description of that Christian age. And even here, he's talking about there shall be a highway for the remnant of the people. That is a way that is clear of obstructions. And as he puts it, uses the illustration, just as when God delivered Israel from the bondage of Egypt, that when they came up out of the land of Egypt, God leading them, God had made preparations for the freedom of his people. And now then, when he frees them from that Egyptian bondage and he guides them and directs them, well, there's that highway. It's clear. It's of obstructions. There's nothing that's going to get in their way. And that's the way in which this is being now described as far as the spread of the gospel, that nothing is going to prevent that spread of the gospel. Someone turn over to Galatians 4 and read verse 4 for us.
But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of woman, made under the law.
Okay. That phrase, in the fullness of time. In other words, God was preparing the world and making everything just right for the coming of the Christ. Just to mention a few things. This by no means is exhaustive. I'm just picking a couple of things out of my head right now. From a linguistic standpoint, if you take, well, even go back before that. Here's the image of Nebuchadnezzar. He was the head of gold. Then what was the next nation? The Medo-Persian Empire. From the Medo-Persian Empire, we learn a great lesson. It was, you remember the law of the Medes and Persians? It could not be changed. There was a respect for law that the Medo-Persian Empire brought to the world. After that, what's the next nation? Greece, or primarily Alexander the Great. With the Grecian Empire, you had Alexander the Great making the decision that the entire world needed to speak Greek. Guess what? It takes a little bit of time, doesn't it? If there was a universal decree today that everyone has to speak Russian, that's going to happen tomorrow, isn't it, in the United States? Y'all are going to speak Russian tomorrow, right? Yeah. Yet. See there? I told you we would. It's even happening tonight. No, it's going to take time to implement that in other nations speaking that language. It actually takes about 200 years to implement that. Now then, what time frame does that put us in? When was Alexander the Great? It's kingdom.
336.
Okay, 330. Let's just put it, round it off. 330. 200 years takes us down to about 130. God had, at that time, with Alexander the Great and his decree, prepared the way for the Messiah with a universal language, the Greek language. So wherever they went, they could always speak Greek and communicate with one another. After the Grecian Empire, what do you have coming up in that image? Rome. about when did they become universal in nature? Usually the date's given around 60. Guess what the Romans didn't like? They don't want everyone speaking Greek. What's their language? Latin. So what do? They send out a decree, no, it's not Greek that you speak. You're going to have to speak Latin. Guess what happens again? Happens overnight, doesn't it? No, it takes a couple of 100 years, in which you have then that period of time called the Koine Greek period. In that time of the Koine Greek period, Koine very simply means common. It was the common language of people. You have the New Testament written. After the writing of the New Testament, that Greek language, Koine Greek, becomes a dead language. Why? Because of Octavian Caesar sending out that decree, everyone learn Latin. And so when you have the end of the New Testament, you have basically the end of that Koine Greek period. So we can go back and look at that period of time today, and we can see, oh, this word means that. God was preparing the way for the spread of the gospel. Why? How? By universal language. Now, what else did the Romans bring? Well, because it was a world empire, you could travel anywhere in the world. But also the Roman system of transportation, their roads. Some of those roads that the Romans prepared back then are still in use today. Why? Because they were so well built. And thus they had a system of transportation, God preparing the way. For what? The spread of the gospel. The fullness of time. God was working all of these things back behind the scenes that no one thinks about. God was working them all to the perfect timing in which He would send His Son to this world to die upon the cross, and then the gospel being produced and it spreading to the entire world within 30 years. Now then, you go back to that. They will fly upon the shoulders, the quickness of it. Within 30 years, the whole world has heard the gospel. Why? Because God had prepared the perfect timing for the gospel, for Christ to come and the gospel to be preached, so that it could be preached in the whole world in a fairly short period of time. So that was the second bell. We'll stop there, and next week, Lord willing, we'll start with chapter 12.